Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world. And I do hope that you've had a phenomenal day and that tonight you're ready to settle down and enjoy a cosy story that you're really going to love, because tonight's story is a double whammy, a Bigfoot and a dogman encounter. It doesn't get better than that. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is James and I'm initially from Hampshire in England, and my Bigfoot encounter happened to me when I moved to America in 1986 after I married my American sweetheart Jenny, and then I moved with her to her country home in West Virginia, which is where I currently reside. Believe it or not, I have had 2 cryptid encounters in my lifetime, and the first one actually occurred in England. But at the time, I had no idea what I was actually witnessing, and I was way too afraid to share my experience with anyone for fear of ridicule. In England, we do tend to keep a stiff upper lip, and if we do see something that others might believe incongruous to our world, many of us are inclined to keep our mouths shut about such peculiarities that seemingly defy natural explanation or understanding. My somewhat bizarre story begins when I was between jobs. I took a short-term job as a bus driver in the Hampshire area, which required taking the bus at various stops to the local town of Andover. I would drive my bus through the ambling British emerald green countryside, passing quaint little pubs, pretty idyllic cottages, meadows full of grazing cows, sheep or even horses, wild flowers and fields of crops. I do remember there was a T-junction on one of those country roads that had become incredibly hazardous for many drivers, which was a peculiar enigma because although the road was a little off the beaten track, it was not in an area of high traffic congestion at all, and it should never have been predisposed to drivers having such terrible accidents. The authorities had even put up a drive carefully sign on that section of the road. It so happened that one of my bus stops was at that Pacific Junction, where every day I would pick up an elderly lady in the close location to that area. The sweet elderly lady would take an eternity to get on and off the bus, as her tortoise-sized footsteps would slide precariously onto one step and then finally onto another. I was always terrified that she was going to fall over. "Hello, Mrs. Taylor," I said warmly to her. "Lovely day, isn't it?" The old lady, who was partially deaf, wobbled dubiously on her feeble, somewhat frail form, struggling to steady her body as she reached for the railings and manoeuvred her body forwards, fumbling with her arthritic fingers to open her purse and hand me a couple of coins for her bus fare, all the while nodding at me. I was just about to press down the accelerator after Mrs. Taylor had finally found a seat and moved the bus forwards when I suddenly noticed this monstrously huge black-like dog creature standing on the side of the T-junction on 2 legs just like a human. In all my life, I have never seen such an extraordinary creature. It was about 300 pounds, covered with dense, thick black hair, and standing on 2 feet. It had the most hostile humanoid red eyes that I have ever seen in my entire life. What the heck is that, I thought to myself, watching the strange bipedal humanoid dog-like creature with a look of stupefied horror developing on my face. Suddenly the creature started throwing a huge rock into the road towards an oncoming car, causing it to suddenly lose control, somersault in the air, crashing violently and landing upside down in a ruinous heap of macerated, pulverized metal. This happened so incredibly quickly, but it almost was as if time stood very still. Suddenly I saw a loose, limp white arm fall out of the car window, and I was pretty sure that the person was dead. It happened so speedily. I immediately called 999 and asked all my passengers on the bus to wait while I dashed off to attend to the driver in the accident. Everyone was making an excitable, buzzing commotion in the bus, as all eyes were peeled to the scene of the accident with a fascinated intrigue. "What happened?" came the shocked voices. "Poor thing, she must be dead," came another voice. "Look, her arm isn't moving." "What happened?" came another voice. On the side of the embankment were several large oak trees, and I saw the huge creature taking cover behind the shade of a very large hefty oak, while he watched all the drama unfold, and I could tell he was enjoying the show rather too much for my liking. I knew that this dog-like humanoid had caused all the chaos and carnage on the road, wantonly, and was watching the flashing blue police cars and the ambulance red bright lights with a grotesque, macabre pleasure. "What the heck happened here?" asked the policeman, taking notes with his book. "I take it you saw what happened. You must be the bus driver that called in on the 999 call." "Well, yes," I said, "that's right." "Did you see what happened?" asked the officer, studying me carefully. "There was this weird dog-like creature on the road throwing a rock at the car. He's hiding behind that bush over there watching us," I said. The policeman looked at me and raised a quizzical eyebrow. I could tell by his ambivalent expression that he was questioning my sanity. "Sir, have you been drinking?" he asked. "You're not making any sense. I'm going to have to ask you to take a breathalyzer." I realised suddenly how crazy I must have sounded, so I said, "I was only joking, officer. I assure you I have not been drinking. I was just trying to be humorous. It's how I react in stressful situations, to make light of them," I said, thinking quickly on my feet. "I always appreciate a little humour, sir, but not in life and death situations like this. It is time to be serious. What did you actually see? Please try and remember. It's very important for my police report, as we have a high level of fatal accidents in this cross-section for some very bizarre, inexplicable reason. Well, I saw a flying rock, and then the car just lost control." "Where did the rock come from?" he asked me. "I'm not sure," I lied. "I think it came from behind that oak tree over there." "That's a long way for a rock to come flying towards a car," said the policeman, looking at me quizzically. "Well, that's what I saw," I insisted. The EMT came to us with a very grim, sombre expression written on his face that informed us that the body was indeed deceased, and as you can imagine, I was mortified. I had told the police that I saw the car had lost control because of a rock, but I knew that this monstrous dog was the real perpetrator of this tragic accident. Yet how could I tell anyone without sounding completely crazy? No one would ever believe me. As you can imagine, from that moment forward, I watched that T-junction like a hawk every time I went past that section of road in my bus to pick up Mrs. Taylor. But I did not see the creature again. One day after hours, I rode my mountain bike to the area and studied the area around the oak tree very cautiously, where I witnessed that the creature had been hiding that day. I noticed some monstrous dog-like impressions in the ground, and they were huge. And then I also discovered piles and piles of pheasant feathers, along with a random bird's head and a couple of feet lying sprawled under the tree. I knew at once the creature had done this, and was possibly living on grouse, pheasants, rabbits and squirrels in the local area. One day when I was buying some groceries at Waitrose in Andover, I did happen to bump into the police officer that I'd encountered at that accident site, and I'm glad to say he recognised me immediately, but he did tease me about my bad sense of humour. He told me that there had been 3 more fatalities at the site, and one lady who was in hospital had survived the harrowing accident at that intersection. I was to discover that the lady was actually a friend of my mother's, talk about a small world, and so I used that perfect excuse to go and visit her in hospital with some flowers from my mother. "That's so sweet of you, dear," she groaned. "How is your mother?" "Mother's fine," I said, "but more to the point, how are you after your harrowing ordeal? That was quite some accident you had. Do you have any recollection of what actually happened?" "It was a flying rock, and I lost control," she said. "Did you see a bipedal, dog-like creature throwing a rock at you?" I asked, boldly figuring out that I might as well just get to the point, for the hell of it. "Yes, I did," said the lady, looking at me in amazement. "I thought if I told anyone what I actually saw, they'd think I'd lost the plot, but I do know what I saw." "How do you know about this bipedal, dog-like creature? Ghastly-looking thing, isn't it? And it's a big monster." Well, I've seen him myself at the site of another accident at the very same spot where you crashed, I told her. I did try to tell the police, but he thought I was off my rocker and that I'd been drinking. Tell me, what did you actually see? Do you remember? Oh, yes, I do. You could never forget that face. That creature was enormous, evil-looking, giant-like dog standing and walking on 2 feet like a human, with horrible red eyes. I saw it actually further down the road as I advanced towards that T-junction, and for a moment I thought the gates of hell had actually opened, as quite literally I saw that thing that I can only describe as a dog-like demon staring at me and glaring at me with hostile, enraged, angry eyes. I could see that it was deliberately aiming a huge rock at my car. As I approached that cross-section, all I know is that my car just lost control. It skidded violently, lifted off the road, and span towards the edge of the embankment, where it crashed violently, pulverizing the passenger side of my car completely. To think that my daughter Amanda was going to come with me that day, but actually decided to stay at home because of a serious migraine headache that wouldn't stop throbbing. For the first time in her life, my daughter was glad to have a banging headache, let me tell you that. You know, she could have certainly died on impact. I'm in no doubt about that. All of this happened because of that awful, evil dog. Yet if I tell anyone about what actually happened, they'll think I've lost my marbles or I've been smoking pot. I agree, I said. For the sake of your sanity, I'm afraid you must keep your mouth shut. No one will ever believe you. I was to learn that there were a few more accidents at that T-junction in the weeks that followed, but then they did finally and thankfully stop altogether. There were rumours that a strange humanoid dog had actually been seen loitering around the area, but no one was willing to believe such a preposterous, outrageous story. To this day I'm convinced I saw a dogman who got off scaring people half to death, causing accidents and even killing people. I do believe he was a physical creature living off the local wild animals in the area, but I believe this monstrous beast enjoyed engendering fear in humans. I am almost certain about that. It was 2 years after that precarious incident that I met my American girlfriend at a pub, and we were having lunch, and I was introduced to her, and from that moment on, we hit it off. It so happened that she was staying with relatives in the area and chose to prolong her stay because of me. In short, I asked her to marry me, and she persuaded me to move in with her in her home in America. Leaving my life in England behind was a huge adjustment for me, but my wife was worth it, and before long, we moved into a pretty little cabin in a wooded area in a very idyllic location in West Virginia. It was somewhat off the beaten track, but only 20 minutes from the local town, which was where I decided to open up a very thriving bookshop. My wife was a very house-proud person, so she transformed our home into a sumptuous, cosy den full of homely, cheerful, soft furnishings and plenty of scatter cushions. One thing I can never get over is a woman's fixation with scatter cushions on couches and beds that invariably have to be removed before you actually get into the bed. But this is not the forum that I should use to discuss such a trivial female peculiarity. We were not living on a large plot of lands by any means, but enough land to raise our own chickens and to grow vegetables. My wife insisted on having a garden full of pretty flowers and a rockery and a greenhouse. On the left-hand side of our land was an area of forest that literally consisted of long-leaf pines, oaks, beeches and hickory trees. The wooded area was teeming with wildlife, and we did occasionally get to see deer, rabbits, squirrels and foxes on our land. From time to time we would have a visitation of the odd black bear, which would delight me to no end, because coming from England, seeing a bear in its natural environment was a huge thrill for me. My wife and I always kept our cars unlocked on the property, because there was no crime in the area, so we pretty much relaxed, but with our coming and goings. I drove a black 8 Dodge Challenger, and my wife had a red 4-cylinder Ford Mustang. One day, as my wife was taking a short trip to the local town to stock up on groceries, she came rushing back into the house to ask me if I had put something smelly in her car. I went through her car with a fine tooth comb and found some long stray strands of human-like auburn hair lying on the back seat, but there was nothing else to speak of. But the place did smell. It smelled disgusting. It was rather like a wet dog, yeasty kind of sweaty odour that also had a stale urine kind of smell about it. I could not figure out what the smell actually was, but it did look like a strange animal had been lying on the back seat of my wife's car. How could they have got in there without opening the car door first, I thought, and that would require the dexterity of a human hand. So I'm not going to kid you, I was somewhat bemused and flummoxed by this whole mystery. Little did I realise that I would soon discover the answer to the mystery, sooner than I actually realised. What I'd like to point out is that my wife only ever used that car about once a week on a Thursday for her shopping. Otherwise, it pretty much remained parked on our gravel driveway under the cover of 2 very large oaks indefinitely, and it was left in a very shaded, comfortable location. One afternoon when I'd come back from work, I decided to ride my mountain bike in the open countryside to get a bit of exercise down a couple of dirt roads. When I did come back from my cycling ride, I parked my bike on the side of the cabin and looked over towards my wife's car. For some strange, unexplained reason, I decided to take a look at the car. I wanted to see whether that god-awful smell had finally dissipated. As I looked at her car, I noticed that there was a massive red, hairy thing lying on her back seat, and whatever it was monstrously huge. I had never seen anything so colossal before, but it was just like a huge wad of hair, and I was so intrigued as to what it actually was. I knew it could not be a bear, because the auburn hair was distinctly human-like in appearance. It was like soft and long. When I placed my ear against the back door of my wife's car, I heard these loud, human-like snores, only they were lower in their tone. I immediately went indoors to retrieve some binoculars, and I chose to hide behind the large oak tree, telling my wife that I would be taking a prolonged brisk walk. I waited and waited for several hours behind that oak tree, and nothing happened, until the sun started to eventually go down. I watched the magnificent tangerine sunset covering the escarpment in its beautiful folds of orange, pinks and golden hues, until finally it was replaced by the smouldering greys of the early evening. Luckily, all the outside lights on our cabin were on, so visibility was excellent. Suddenly I heard the rattling sound of my wife's car door opening very slowly, and then I saw this Herculean-like hairy humanoid ape emerging from the car. That's the only way that I can describe him. He had a very distinct look of a silverback gorilla. The creature towered at about 7 feet tall, 500 pounds, and 4 feet in width. It was tall, lofty, majestic, and powerful looking, and was literally covered with soft flowing auburn hair from head to toe, and apart from the face, which appeared to be a pinky brown colour. I studied the creature through the binoculars, and it was light enough to take in the details of the face. It appeared that the creature had huge muscular shoulders, virtually no neck to speak of, and a very distinct bullet-shaped head. The face was long, and the pinkish skin appeared leathery, with a very distinct prominent brow ridge that was deeply furrowed with wrinkles, a flat nose, a thin mouth, and dark brown, rusty-coloured eyes. As the creature got out of the car, it raised its very extensive long arms to the sky, as if he was reaching for the clouds, and then he stretched, making a peculiar grunting sound. And then he reached to the ground and stretched again, and then he just literally sped away from the car at lightning speed, suddenly disappearing into the woods. His movements flowed seamlessly as he took huge 5-feet strides with his long, agile legs. He was magnificent to watch, even if I say so myself. I was so thrilled to have observed such an unusual creature, and I did not know what on earth it could be. I had never heard of such a creature existing before. There were no scientific books that described such a creature. If they did, I would know about it because I owned a bookstore. I never told my wife about him because I knew she wouldn't be happy that a monster-like creature was actually taking refuge in our car and under the cool shade of the oak tree. I kid you not, for many years I actually got to see this creature sleeping in my wife's car, not every day, but very regularly, and I never grew tired of watching and observing it. Sometimes I even left bags of apples, peaches and grapes and nuts in the car for it to be able to eat. So I believe my wife's car became a place of refuge for him, where he could indulge in a few special treats. And believe me, he ate everything I left him. My wife relentlessly complained about how smelly her car was, and actually wrote to the manufacturers of Mustang complaining about their seats, because she said that the fabric that they used to upholster the seats with appeared to harbour very unpleasant smells that could not be easily removed with lots of scrubbing. The manufacturer replied saying that to date they had not had any complaints from other customers concerning that issue, and that perhaps she should invest in a car deodorizer. As you can imagine, my wife was furious. When my wife traded in her old car for a Buick Reatta, the mysterious creature no longer came back to take refuge and sanctuary in the back of her car, much to my great disappointment. I guess he did not like the Buick, so all these years later she still believes that the upholstery in the Mustang car is substandard and absorbs nasty smells and odours. I have never had the heart to actually tell her the truth. It was only in 2008 that I came to realise that the mystery creature that I encountered frequently taking refuge in the back of my wife's car was in fact a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch or a Yeti, and I believe these creatures are remarkably clever. The creature almost always avoided my wife's car on a Thursday, when she did her morning shop. How did he know and discern that day? That I will never know. One thing I do know is that I did encounter a Bigfoot, and I do hope your listeners enjoyed the story. Well, I just want to say thank you so very much for that amazing story. It was absolutely fascinating, and I think we feel very spoilt tonight to actually have a Bigfoot encounter and a Dogman encounter, because Dogman is very fascinating to so many of us. And it does seem that this Dogman rarely got off on terrorising human beings. He wasn't actually going to eat these people. He was actually wanting to cause them to have a terrible accident in their car. And so it does show an incredible amount of evil in the creature. And I do know that people describe their encounters with Dogman as being extremely evil. So even if this creature doesn't intend to eat a human, he certainly wants to terrorise them. Of that I'm in no doubt. As for the Bigfoot, I can't imagine anything more wonderful than discovering a Bigfoot taking refuge in the back of the car. And I love the fact that your wife actually wrote to the manufacturers of Mustang complaining about the upholstery in the back of the car being quick to absorb nasty odours. Little did she realise that the reason the odour never left the upholstery was because a Bigfoot was pretty much parked in her car every single day, except for a Thursday morning. So thank you so much for that amazing story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.